Alright, so as mentioned in the last video, we are going to be creating a Previs rig for this little guy. It's the proportions of like a gnome or a particularly chubby little child. And the purpose of the Previs rig is just to be able to do some basic block out animation, to be able to make a lot of animation decisions very quickly, whether this is for an animation or a game. Alright, so before I start placing any bones, I'm going to want to be in an orthographic view. Now by orthographic, I mean it's one of these views underneath the panels tab at the top of your viewport. And right now, my back camera is currently set to facing the character because, well, sometimes I'm a bit of a dork when I set up my cameras. Alright, so when I'm working in an orthographic view, which is a flat, almost 2D representation of your 3D space, it means that I can place joints and move them around fairly easily. Now if I try and do that in 3D space, I'll just show you what happens. If I start placing joints down, well, it's going to snap to a grid, only it has snapped to that grid in 3D. Thereby creating something that is very difficult to work with. So we are going to start in an orthographic view that faces the character, and then we will switch to an orthographic view that looks at the character's side on and fix the positioning of our joints. Now let me just give you a quick preview as to the kind of rig we are going to be building. Now this is a relatively simple rig. This is going to be a 20 joint rig. Now we can make it much more simple. There's a 5-bone starfish rig that I am desperate to try, but it is just a little bit alarming. So by 20 joints, I mean there are 20 bones that make up this skeleton, and each of those bones allow the character to move freely. You'll see that we've got just one bone down here, which is currently controlling the rotation of the hand and the thumb. One bone controls rotation of the neck and the head, and one bone controls the rotation of the feet. Otherwise we have bones at the middle of the back, the pelvis area, the hips, the knees, the elbows, and the shoulders. So let's build that first, and then we will go through and create controllers. Now, while I work on a skeleton, it's very important that I not be able to select the geometry when I'm trying to select the bones, because that can make it very difficult to just see what it is I'm currently selecting and what it is I'm currently manipulating, and it's just a general pain in the butt. So I always try to add all of my character geometry onto its own layer. Now you'll see that I currently have that on a layer here in my layer window, but I'll just show you how to create a new layer now. So I'll select all my character geometry, and I'll deselect everything else, which for anyone who has forgotten, you hold down Control, and then you drag a little selection box around something and it will deselect it. Now with all of that character geometry selected, there's this button on the far right of the Layers panel called Create a New Layer and Assign Selected Objects. So when I click that, there we have it, Layer 1. If I press that little V, you'll see I can make my character disappear and reappear. Now I'm going to name that right away. So by just double-clicking on the layer, I have this little text window which I can say layer underscore tiny tot, for lack of a better name. And I'll give him his own personal color so that he can be differentiated from our hero character here. Okay, now that he is on his own layer, what I can do is with this very middle button here on the layer, I can set him to template, which creates this ghostly gray little outline, or I can set him to reference, which means I can see him perfectly fine, but I can't actually select him by accident. Again, makes my job much easier. So now that I've got him set up on a reference layer, I'll go to orthographic and the camera that's currently facing that character. And I will start placing down bones. Now, to be able to place down bones and see through my geometry, I like to use this mode called X-ray, which essentially creates an X-ray of your character, and you can see all the little spheres and such that make up the joints that I've created for this Previs puppet. So, to start laying down bones, and I'll start with the pelvis, I'm going to go up to the skeleton drop-down menu at the very top of my Maya window. Now, if you can't see these options, skeleton, skins, constrain, it could be that you are in a different tool set. So you'll see in this drop-down on the far left, each of these different tool sets changes my available menus. So I'm going to make sure I'm in the animation tool set. And that gives me access to skeleton and joint tool. So, by selecting that, my cursor has become a little crosshair now, and I can actually place a bone somewhere center in the body. Now, I want to be smack dab in the center, which means I want to be on like one of these little crisscrossing edge loops here. And an easy way for me to do that is if I hold down V on my keyboard, and if I'm holding that while I left click, it will snap. Well, in theory it would snap to a vertice, but once I've placed that down, I can hold down V while I move it and snap it to a vertice. Alright, so now that's currently the belly button, which is not the pelvis in any way, shape, or form. So I'm going to drag that down until it's about just where the pelvis bone, the pelvis girdle actually would be. And I will name that JT for joint underscore pelvis. Alright, new joints. So next chain I'm going to create, so every time you point and click a few times in a row, you'll create a chain. It's going to be for the hips. Now I'm going to pick the widest point of the hip. Here's my guide, so that's about where the hip bone needs to be. I'll try and get somewhat close to the middle of that geometry. If I click down once, and then click down again in the knees, and a final time in the ankles, you'll see I get this little joint chain created, and if I press enter when I'm done, I could move that around freely if I wanted to. I don't particularly want to. Now I can actually connect this into that pelvis joint right away. If I just select that joint chain for the legs, and I hold down Shift and select the pelvis, I can press P on my keyboard, and that will parent that leg chain into the pelvis joint. Now before I go any further, let's just quickly name these joints. It's extremely good habit to constantly keep the objects that you're working with following a good and clean naming convention, because your scene is going to get very busy and at some point going to start spitting out errors. You want to be able to find what objects are causing those errors as fast as possible. Alright, so I'm not going to place the foot joint just yet. I'll actually do that in the side view. But the next thing I can do is I can build up my spine and then my arm. So, skeleton, joint tool, and I will place a joint roughly in the middle of, so mid-spine, which for this character is between his upper and lower body, since there isn't a whole lot going on there. And then I'll place the second joint for his spine just at the base of the neck, and that's probably coming a bit too high, so I'll adjust that later. And I will drop in a null joint at the top of the head. A null joint is a joint that itself won't do a whole lot, but it gives something at this joint at the neck to rotate around. Don't quote me, this is not exact science. I am sure there are better ways to do this. Now, if you can see, I'm snapping slightly at the moment. You can snap to positions by holding down X, and that will allow you to snap the grid. And if you control Z while you are moving your stuff around, apparently it's going to snap all the way down to the base 0 line, which was very exciting. Okay, so this is going to be joint waist and joint neck, finally joint head null, and let's parent this spine into the pelvis. So I'll select the waist and I'll hold down shift and select the pelvis, and if I hit P, you'll see that that is now all parented in. By parent, I mean if I do anything with that pelvis bone, the rest of the rig will follow it. Okay, let's get the arm in, and then we're going to mirror these joints. So I'm always going to start at the top of the chain, so it's the top of whatever should be the parent of everything below it. Now when I move my shoulder, obviously my elbow should follow, and then my wrist should follow my elbow. So it makes sense for the shoulder to be the top of the chain. Now if I had started with the wrist first, that means when I move the wrist, the entire arm would break off the character in some macabre, terrifying scene, which may be totally appropriate if you're making a scary film, but if you're not, let's just actually build our skeletons the way we ought to. What do you think? Okay, so I will place one in the center of that shoulder, drop one in the elbow, finally one in the wrist, press enter. I have my complete chain. Let's quickly name that. Now, you may be looking at this going, why, oh why, are you calling this left shoulder when clearly this arm is on the right? Well, I'm facing this character, which means I am looking at screen right. But the moment he turns away from me, I will actually be looking at his left arm. So it makes sense for me to name it appropriately. Okay, so now where to parent this shoulder joint in? So if I parented it to, say, the neck, and that means when I turn my neck, my shoulder would move. That doesn't actually happen in real life. If I parented this to, say, the pelvis, then that means, well, when my pelvis moves, my shoulder would move. Ooh, this was a very scary thing that just happened. But when my mid-back moves, oh, guess what I've just found? I've just found an incomplete joint chain. Aha! Okay, so let's go back to perspective real quick and look at this crazy thing that's just happened. So what I thought was connected from pelvis into waist into neck was actually connected from pelvis to waist and pelvis to neck. How do you fix this, you may ask? Well, the easiest thing to do would be to unparent this neck. So I will just go select that, and I'll go edit, unparent, and then just parent that neck into the waist. And now it is set up correctly. That's one of the reasons why it's a very good idea to switch backwards and forwards from your orthographic and perspective views, because you can often catch those silly little errors. Now, as I was demonstrating, if I were to move my pelvis, my shoulder would move. But if I were to move my mid-back, my shoulder doesn't move, it stays where it is. Which, if you were to take a moment to bend at the waist, you'll find that your shoulders are conveniently connected to the rest of your spine, and will follow where your waist goes, which is again going to avoid a bloody, gory mess at your computer table. So let's actually make sure that that shoulder is connected into the rest of the spine, such that when you do move at the waist, the shoulder follows, and all gore has been avoided. Now I just noticed that I've forgotten to add a joint at the end of the hand here, so I can just do that quickly. Just drop that at the where the fingers are, and press enter to say I'm done creating that chain. Select the wrist and hit P for parent. and you'll see that it is now parented into the rest of the chain. Now what would have happened if I selected it the other way around? If I select the wrist first, and then select the tip of the hand and hit P, you'll see that the wrist suddenly disconnects from the elbow and treats the fingertip as its point of rotation, creating some very strange effects. So let's not do that either. Okay, so what I have is I have a skeleton that vaguely looks like it should in front view, but it's going to look a bit different in side view. Now you'll notice that the skeleton on one character is conveniently bright green, while the skeleton on my other character is dark blue and hard to see. That's because this skeleton is currently part of the layer joints group, layer joints layer. And if I add my new skeleton to that by selecting that pelvis joint, going into layer joints, and right-clicking and holding to get this drop-down menu, I can select Add Selected Objects, and that skeleton will now inherit the same bright lime green coloring. Okay, so before I mirror any joints at all, let's make sure everything's in its proper place. So I'm going to switch to, let's see what the right camera shows me. The right camera shows me entirely too much. So what we're going to do is grab our female character here, and we will create this group. We'll call her Yolanda Previs, and we're just going to hide that. Notice how my IK handles did not follow. Alright, let's make sure those IKs go in as well. And I will also add those to actually, it's a much better way to do this. Let's just go back to before I was a dork, before I had created that group, and you see how we've got a separate layer for Tiny Tot? We are going to create a separate layer for Yolanda. So we'll just go layer Yolanda Previs, and again come in, grab these IK handles and just add them to the Yolanda layer, and now all I see is my funny looking little skeletal man. So let's swap to the left viewport. Already some of these bones have got to move. So let's start with that pelvis bone. Now if I hold down D on my keyboard, you'll see that the manipulator here changes. Holding down D means I can move just this bone into position, and it doesn't move the rest of the skeleton. Whereas if I were not holding down D, I would be moving the entire skeleton together at once, which is not the ideal. So I'm going to move that into about the center of his pelvis. Now you may find this easier to work with if you're actually seeing the front and the side view at the same time. You can do that by coming up to Panels, Layouts, 2 panes side by side, and in one of these I will set this to my forward facing camera, and the other I'll set this to my sideways facing camera, which I will have to then set up as X-ray. Okay, so, and you're welcome to experiment with the 2 cameras until you find one that sort of reveals everything to you. Pelvis is in position. Let's make sure that mid-back is also in position. Once more, I'm going to hold down D and drag that forward just in one axis at a time. I'm not going to drag the middle of this object. I'm just going to drag along the Z. So his neck is pretty much where I want it to be. I'm quite happy with that. The hips, however, could come forward slightly to about where those hip bones are likely to come in. And there we go. I had snapping turned on up here. Whenever you're snapping on your screen and you don't know why your manipulator handles aren't just smoothly transitioning from one state to another, you can go up and check to see if any of those little magnets have been turned on. So I will move that hip bone to about where it fits into the socket, and we'll move that knee bone forward and that ankle bone forward as well. Now you'll notice I have very intentionally created a bend in the knee, and when I move this arm forward, you will see that I have also intentionally created a bend in the arm. That's because when I create my K handles, I want it to be very clear to Maya exactly what direction that arm should bend in. I certainly don't want a character that looks like it's breaking its elbow every time it tries to pick something up. Okay, last thing I want to do while I'm here is place the joint for the foot. And I can make sure that that's actually in the right place, which it really isn't, if you can tell. It's currently off in space, by switching back to my front view as well to just line that up a little bit better. And then I will parent that in. And of course, I'm going to name that since I've created it. So joint, foot, null. Let's make sure that we've got the left there as well. Alright, so now what we have is we have a skeleton, but it still needs a little bit of work before we can actually start adding in our controls. If I swap back to perspective mode, now you'll see that if I try to rotate one of these, this rotates pretty clean. You can see my rotations are set up at a clean forwards and backwards. But if I go one down, my rotation is suddenly very different. And that's not bending the way an elbow is supposed to bend. Not at all. So I want all these rotations to be facing the same way that my actual knees and elbows are facing. So I'm going to select the pelvis, which is currently the parent of the skeleton. Go up to skeleton and orient joint options. Now I like to orient the joints to the world because that gives me a clean X and Z forwards and backwards rotation. By default, it does not have that selected, so I go ahead and turn that on. I'll hit apply. You'll see all those joints suddenly snapped into a different position. And if I come in and look at these rotations again, I get Z, I get Y, I get X, and in exactly the same position, Z, X, and Y. So just remember, folks, if you're going to be doing any building of skeletons, you want to make sure that your orients are actually clean before you do any constraints or controls, because bad orients are going to contribute to bad animations. Okay, so our skeleton is half built. It's now time to mirror these joints. So if I just select the shoulder here and I go up to skeleton, I can go mirror joint, and that will snap that over to the other side of the body. And now you'll notice, rather than intelligently anticipating that I might want to name that shoulder something other than left, it has just called it left shoulder 1. So I'm going to have to quickly come in and update those names before I do anything else. You may think this is tedious and unnecessary, but I promise you, the moment you run into errors that involve poor naming convention, you are going to feel extremely stupid for letting that slip through. Ha! Just like this one. Joint, right, hand, null. Just imagine having 20 characters in a scene, and the error message that you get coming up says joint 253 not found. What the hell is joint 253? Where the hell is it? How do you even begin to find it? Whereas if you have everything named correctly, you know exactly what you're dealing with. Okay, our nulls are taken care of. Let's quickly mirror those hips, and if you need to change your mirror options, it's always this little box at the right, and you can mirror across the different axes. Now we have a mirrored skeleton. Everything's in the right place. I will just double check that these rotations are clean, that the joints are sitting appropriately inside of that skeleton. And when I'm happy, then I'll start to begin to build the controllers for this. Okay, that is for the next video, so I'll stop this one now.